Hello everyone and welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. Each week together we will take a look at a unique and fascinating piece of history. As gruesome, mysterious or unbelievable as these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have made their mark on our historical landscape. Be sure to check out the website mysteriesofhistory.com where you can access all of the podcasts and show notes, and of course the blog where we will give you some extra insight into each episode as well as all sorts of unbelievable historical content. You can also find us on social media where you can let us know what you make of the podcast episodes and gives you all a chance to start a good old historical debate. So now let's take a look at this week's mysterious historical tale. The year is 1607 and King James I, formerly King James VI of Scotland, is on the English throne and King of England and Ireland and Scotland as ruler in personal union. And that simply means a monarch ruling two distinct states, because at this time Scotland had its own parliament, judiciaries and laws. The King James Bible is being written in English, and there is religious tension between the Protestants and Catholics. Catholics were feeling persecuted by the Protestant movement led by the Puritans, and this leads to a group of Catholic conspirators led by Robert Catesby who try and blow up Parliament with the king in residence and replace James I with a Catholic monarch. The gunpowder plot as we know it in England of 1605 is foiled, and things do not end well for Guy Fawkes and a few of his friends. And indeed, in the UK on the 5th of November, this victory, if you like, over the conspirators is still celebrated as part of Guy Fawkes Night, or Fireworks Night, where an effigy of poor old Guy Fawkes is thrown onto a bonfire and lots of fireworks are set off in celebration of the continued rule of the British monarch. Whether or not many people in Britain actually know what they're celebrating anymore on Guy Fawkes Night and understand the history is debatable, but there we are on the 5th of November, there's lots of fireworks going off. Anyway, back to 1607, William Shakespeare is performing his plays in London as part of the King's Men, and this is an acting company which Shakespeare was part of, and also the colonisation of the Americas was established in Jamestown, Virginia, primarily for economic gain. People were looking for gold resources and trading routes to the Orient. Now, at this point, we must clear something up that is quite important before we go any further. And that is the year actually 1607? And you indeed may ask, what am I talking about? However, I haven't quite lost the plot, so let me explain. Some contemporary records give the date for this particular event as January the 20th, and others give it as January the 30th, and the year is either 1606 or 1607. A logical explanation is that there must have been two events, but the real explanation is really quite fascinating. First of all, let's have a look at the date. Was it January the 20th or January the 30th? Now, our current calendar year was not always as it is now. Now, in 45 BC, the Julian calendar was introduced by the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, and this was based on a solar year with 12 months and a leap year every 4 years. It was the main Roman calendar in the Roman Empire and most of the Western world for over 1600 years. And it was used during the life of Jesus Christ and the early church. However, the Julian calendar was not entirely accurate, and over time it became about 8 days too long every millennium or 1,000 years. And this meant that the calendar had become out of sync with the real seasons. So in order to rebalance things and realign the year with the seasons, the Catholic Church, now remember the religious tensions between the Puritans and Catholics in the 17th century, introduced a new calendar called the Gregorian calendar, and this had fewer leap days, and 10 days were dropped from this calendar to realign it more with the seasons. This was overseen by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. Now, there was a big problem with the Gregorian calendar in the 17th century, and yes, you've guessed it, it was Catholic. We won't get too involved with the religious hatred between the Puritans, the Protestants and the Catholics here. We'll add some more information about that on our blog. But there was a real hatred between the two religious groups across the whole of Northern Europe, mixed in with fear and lack of trust. And these tensions had existed for hundreds of years previously. So inevitably, there was a slow uptake of the Gregorian calendar. Many people viewed it as the enemy calendar, despite it actually being a real improvement of the Julian calendar. Now, England in particular was slow to adopt the new calendar, and the city of Bristol, a place that's going to become very relevant soon, still used the Julian calendar, and the date was January the 20th here. But cities like London, cosmopolitan and some would argue more progressive in their thinking, started to use the Gregorian calendar, and this was also in use in France and Spain by the 17th century. And in London, France and Spain, reports of the events that we're going to talk about soon were referred to as occurring on January the 30th. Now that's the date dealt with. How about the year? Now, whilst the Julian calendar began on the 1st of January, in some parts of Europe during the medieval period, including England, the start of the year shifted to the 25th of March, and this is known as Ladies' Day, or Lady Day, after the fall of the Roman Empire to align with the Christian festival of Annunciation. And this is when the Archangel Gabriel tells Mary that she will become pregnant with the Son of God. Now, as we've discussed, the Gregorian calendar confirmed the start of the year as the 1st of January. Now, those people or regions that did not accept the Gregorian calendar did generally accept the 1st of January as the start of the year. So, under the Gregorian calendar, late January was 1607, but for those still following the medieval tradition, it was still 1606. Now, I know I've been deviating away from the main topic of this podcast, but I think it's quite an interesting discussion as to what year this event actually happened in and the reasons for why it's described as either 1606 or 1607. Now, there is one last really interesting fact relating to what we've discussed before we move on, and I don't want anyone switching off, but I'm going to talk to you about tax. Now, why does the UK tax year start from the 5th of April, you may ask? Well, when the Gregorian calendar was adopted, I mentioned that 10 days were dropped from the Julian calendar to realign it with the seasons. Well, this became 11 days, and the 25th of March became the 5th of April. So what we can say is that the UK tax authorities recognised the change in day as per the Gregorian calendar, but stuck with the medieval concept of the beginning of the year. But for the purposes of this podcast, this discussion, we are going to call the date the 30th of January 1607 as per the Gregorian calendar. Now, for this episode, we are in the southwest region of the United Kingdom, England specifically. And I mentioned Bristol, the city of Bristol, becoming an important factor to this discussion. And we are very near Bristol. We're actually discussing the area around the Bristol Channel, and more specifically the population that lived along the South Wales coastline to the north of the Bristol Channel, and to the south of the Bristol Channel, the North Somerset and North Devon coastline. I'll put a few maps on the blog that will show you exactly the area that we're talking about, and in fact maps and graphics to show you exactly the effect that this event had. Now, what is this event that we're talking about? This event is a possible tsunami that occurred up through the Bristol Channel in the early morning of the 30th of January 1607. Now, the local populations on the north coast of the Bristol Channel and to the south, the coast of Somerset and Devon, the population, the people, were completely unaware of what was about to happen to them. But more than 2,000 people are about to lose their lives to the power of the ocean, and they know nothing about it. You've got to imagine it's about 9 a.m. in the morning, people are going about their daily business, and suddenly floods of water hit the people. villages, entire villages reportedly swept away, over 200 square miles of land and whole herds of livestock were destroyed instantly. Eyewitnesses describe huge and mighty hills of water, 25 foot high, advancing at over 30 miles an hour, described as faster than a greyhound can run. And the water only receded 10 days later. This was, and still remains, an unprecedented natural disaster in the history of the UK, and not many people know about it. Now, at this time, the reporting of news and events from around the UK were limited, and newspapers would only come into circulation in about the 1620s. So instead, pamphlets were often produced in early printing presses with really ornate woodcuts to give people images of what they're describing. Now, fortunately for us, one such pamphlet was produced in London in 1607 called Of Floods in England. And this describes the terrible events on the morning of the 30th of January 1607. And I'll also put some pictures of some of the pages on the blog and social media. There are some really impressive woodcut illustrations that really give you a sense of the drama at the time. Now, the pamphlet gives us a really good insight into contemporary observations of the flood tsunami. For example, in Cardiff, now the capital of Wales, but at the time, in 1607, not more than a fishing village. Now here, the wave reached up to 4 miles inland and washed away everything in its path, including the foundations of the parish church of St Mary's Street, the main church in Cardiff. The author of the pamphlet tells us about the disaster and destruction as follows. Men that were going to their labours were compelled, seeing so dreadful an enemy approaching, to fly back to their houses, yet before they could enter, death stood at their doors ready to receive them. In a short time did whole villages stand like islands, and in more short time were those islands undiscoverable and nowhere to be found. Now this really illustrates how unexpected the whole event was, and it must have been incredibly terrifying. Now on the north coast of Devon, which is to the south of the Bristol Channel, the town of Barnstaple was the first place to be affected by the flood. As the waves crashed in, houses were swept away and the entire seafront was demolished. And here more than 200 people reportedly died. And the water reached about 1.5 to 2 meters higher than had ever been seen before. Now, a contemporary author and barrister called Walter Young wrote about the events at Barnstaple and the Somerset town of Bridgwater, as well as the city of Bristol. And he describes the following. Now, just note the date and year he quotes as well. The 20th of January, 1606 to 1607, by reason of a great tempest, the sea broke in at diverse places on the north side of this country, as at Barnstaple, where was much hurt done. At Bridgwater, 2 villages near thereabouts, and 1 market town overflown, and report of 500 persons drowned, besides many sheep and other cattle. At Bristol it flowed so high that diverse packs which were brought thither against St Paul's Fair, standing together in a common hall of the city for such purposes, stood 3 foot deep in water. Again, this eyewitness account description just describes utter disaster and carnage for towns and people that just would not have been expecting anything like this to happen in their lives. Now, the flood reached furthest inland in the Somerset Levels. In fact, it reached 14 miles inland in this region. Now, the Somerset Levels are a coastal plain and wetland area that cover over 400 miles. And the water even reached the historic town of Glastonbury and the surrounding villages. Local churches mark the high water marks of the flood or tsunami, and some are preserved to this day. In fact, based on these markings, the water reached about 7 meters above ordnance datum AOD that's called, and this is basically the height measured above sea level on the Welsh coastline and 7.5 metres on the Somerset levels. Now, if you have a look at the blog, and in fact the cover art for this podcast, you will see a woodcut showing the flooding at the 12th century church at Nash in Newport, which is in Wales, South Wales. Now, I'll also post a modern photo of this same church to give you an idea of the level of the flooding that is depicted in the woodcut. However, the use of artistic license in the 17th century was commonplace. So as good historians, we can't take the woodcut as being entirely factual. Now, amongst all of this death and utter misery, the London pamphlet of 1607 does mention stories of people's unbelievable will to survive, written with typical 17th century flair. And there's one account that I think is quite interesting to share with you, as follows. Here comes a husband with his wife on his back and under each arm an infant. The son carries the father, the brother the sister, the daughter the mother, whilst the unmerciful conqueror breaks down the walls of the houses. Yet like a merciful conqueror, having taken the town, it gave them their lives. So we now have a bit of a picture of what unfolded and the tragedy that unfolded and the destruction that it left behind. But we need to know what caused this event. I keep calling it an event because was it a tsunami or was it something else? So let's take each explanation that has been given for this event and we'll go through them and discuss it. Now, the first theory that was put forward is actually a contemporary theory. So this is what people would have believed at the time. Now, it's no surprise that the first theory we're going to call the God theory. And we may as well start with God because remember we're in the 17th century and religion is at the forefront of everyone's lives. Now, contemporary reports were keen to place the cause of this disaster upon the Almighty One, and even viewed the flood as a warning of his displeasure, as the following contemporary extract highlights. If this affliction laid upon our country now be sharper than that before, make wise of it. Tremble, be forewarned, amend, lest a more fearful punishment and a longer whip of correction draw blood of us. Now, you may well have a similar opinion. Case closed. But what an effective way to control a God-fearing and rebellious society. To be fair to the people of the time, though, actually, this would have been a perfectly reasonable explanation. People have been bad and God is going to punish them with a flood. And this has connotations with the Great Flood, of course, in the Bible involving Noah. Now, as someone who has had a scientific training, I was actually trained as a geologist, I would look for other explanations for this event. And there are two very plausible scientific explanations and theories for what actually happened on the 30th of January. Now, the first theory we're going to call the storm surge theory. Now, it has long been thought that a combination of a high spring tide, in fact, on the 30th of January 1607, it was the highest it had been in 4.5 years, and a storm surge could have caused a mass of water that caused such devastation along the coastline and villages surrounding. In fact, on the morning of the 30th of January 1607, the tide was 2.5 metres higher than in the evening. And the reason for this is that a westerly gale was driving water up the Bristol Channel. Now, we also have contemporary accounts to back up this theory. Now, a John Paul, a vicar of Almondsbury, describes, but the year 1606, the 4th of King James, the river of Severn rose up a sudden Tuesday morning on the 20th of January, being the full prime day and highest tide after the change of the moon by reason of a mighty strong western wind. And in the town of Barnstaple, the parish registrar records, the storm began at 3 o'clock in the morning and continued until 12 o'clock on the same day. Now, in fact, modelling has shown that an additional water height of about 2.3 metres above the tide could fit the pattern of flooding along the Bristol Channel. Now, this theory is one that some scientists and others believe is what happened on the morning of the 30th of January 1607. They don't believe that there could have been an earthquake powerful enough to have caused a tsunami. But let's see. And our third theory, funnily enough, is called the tsunami theory. Now, in 2004, Professor Simon Hazlitt, head of geography at Bath Spa University, and Dr. Ted Bryant of the School of Geosciences at Wollongong in Australia wrote a joint paper. And again, I'll put a link to this on the blog page. And they suggest that the cause of the widespread flooding was the result of a tsunami. Now, a tsunami has to be caused by a massive release of energy somewhere. And this, in geological terms, would be called a seismic event. Now, that's either going to be an earthquake along an active fault system or a landslide. Now, as it happens, there is actually active faults in the Irish Sea, so the area south of Ireland, and there could even have been a landslide off the continental shelf between Ireland and Cornwall. Now, either of those events would have caused a massive release of energy that would have manifested into large waves as the energy was transferred to the water and dissipated over the low-lying land of the coastline of the Bristol Channel. And indeed, contemporary accounts do seem to describe a tsunami, as the pamphlet called God's Warning to His People of England outlines as follows. They might see and perceive afar off, as it were in the element, huge and mighty hills of water, tumbling one over another in such sort as if the greatest mountains in the world has overwhelmed the low valleys of earthly grounds. Sometimes it is so dazed the eyes of many of the spectators. Now, this account does indeed suggest that there were huge waves coming ashore, and the people were facing giant tsunami-like waves. And as we've discussed, it is the speed of the waves that is quite important in terms of evidence for or to support a tsunami. In previous accounts, contemporary accounts we've discussed earlier, the fact that the waves were described as running with a swiftness so incredible that no greyhound could have escaped by running before them. Now that is good evidence to suggest that the waves were travelling at speed. And indeed, as scientists would suggest, faster than water from a storm flood. Now, as part of the investigation that Hazlitt and Bryant carried out to support the paper that they produced, they carried out a series of fieldwork expeditions to the area to try and find any evidence of the tsunami, and they describe and say that they did indeed find such evidence. They found erosion of rock along the coastline that is characteristic of erosion caused by high velocity water flow, or in other words, a tsunami. And they found two particular areas where this is evident. Large chunks of farmland on the Severn estuary, which is just north of Bristol, were simply washed away, and one where the foundation of the Severn, or the second River Severn crossing is, the bridge, and the other is now the reservoir for the Oldbury nuclear power station. They also found deposition of layers of sand over wide areas, and these were discovered in boreholes in the ground from North Devon, Gloucestershire, all the way to the Gower, South Wales. They also found large boulders that were that could only have really been moved by a tsunami or tsunami waves. And these have been found stacked above high tide limits or high tide marks all along the coastline. Now, the evidence that Hazlitt and Bryant collected in the field or during their field work enabled them to make reasonable estimates as to the height of the tsunami and indeed the speed that the tsunami was travelling at. Now, they think that in the open sea area between North Devon and Pembrokeshire, the wave was about, or just under 4 metres or 13 feet high. But as it entered the Bristol Channel, which acted like a funnel, and up the Severn Estuary, the wave increased in height to about 5 metres or 16 feet, which is just incredible. And as for the speed of the tsunami, or the velocity, again, as the waves are being squeezed up the estuary, it effectively got faster. So they think that the tsunami struck the coast at about 12 metres a second, or 27 miles an hour, in North Devon and southwest Wales, and about 14 metres a second, or 31 miles an hour, along the Glamorgan coast, the South Wales coast. Now in Somerset, in the Somerset levels, they believe that the waves were travelling at about 14.5 metres a second, or 32 miles an hour. And interestingly, these calculations do tie in and agree with contemporary observations at the time as to the speed of the tsunami wave. So there we have our three theories that try to explain the cause of the event in 1607. We have the God theory, the storm surge theory, and finally the tsunami theory. And if you had to ask me which one I think is correct, I'm a little bit biased, but I do believe that the evidence points to it being a tsunami, and that is quite an incredible thing if we're really saying that a tsunami struck the southwest coast of England and caused 2,000 people to die. Now, we do still have flooding in the southwest of England, and in particular on the Somerset levels. That is not an unusual thing at all. Now, a logical question to ask is, could this happen again? And I think the simple answer is yes, it could happen again. And the reason for that is that we still have active fault systems out to the south coast of Ireland. And although they tend not to produce larger earthquakes, there's every possibility that they could produce an earthquake large enough to cause a tsunami. Naturally, our flood defences now are much better than in 1607, but if we're talking about the height of the waves that we've just described in this podcast, they would still breach the current flood defences that we have. And I think it's just worth pointing out that on the north coast of Somerset, things have changed slightly since 1607, and we now have a nuclear power station on the north coast of Somerset near or just outside of Bridgewater. Now, I'm an optimist, and I would hope that there is never an earthquake large enough to cause a tsunami, but it's just something to ponder. Nuclear power stations use lots of water, so they generally have to be placed on the coastline. So, it's there for a reason, and there won't be another tsunami, will there? Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out our blog at themysteriesofhistory.com and social media outlets where we'll post extra info and images for each episode. So until next week, stay curious. The mysteries of history remain.